Hey kids, continuing our discussion of the Crucible, I am currently hiding in the English office. Some of you are doing the first part of the assignment in class while Miss McKean watches you. It's like covert teaching, like I'm hiding so that I can take my mask down and record properly. It's very strange. This is a strange world. We talked a little bit at the end of last lecture about how the courtroom in Salem was set up and how this was manipulated by the girls. So in short, if I had to kind of tell you why the setup of the judges was so important, it was because of how the girls figured out how they could be listened to. So in the courtroom, it's the same place that they would have gone for church. It's a meeting house. And the meeting house was separated on the bottom floor by women and men, and then there was a top floor that had the same sex divide. Men and women are not allowed to sit next to each other. You would have put the kids on the top to keep them away from the main action on the bottom floor in case they were loud. So men and women, children, everyone in divided sections. The people who were accused were pulled to the front of the courtroom where there were benches set forth. Accused and in this case, the big group of girls, the accusers, they were called criers. They cried which, literally over the top crying often occurred. And then on the top, in a bench, in a very assertive position, you had the judges and the reverends of the town who were in charge of deciding guilt and innocence. And it was a direct one-for-one thing. If the judges looked at you and they believed your testimony, they said, I believe their testimony. There's no going off and having a jury assess the situation. There's no time to pause and reflect. It's sort of live, in-person, snappy responses. This in many ways is highly flawed, right? Like when we restructure our judicial system, we get away from this. Now, interesting in Salem, a couple of things. I said that spectral evidence was allowed, and I explained spectral evidence saying that the girls could cry witch and say the spirit of one of the accused haunted them in the night. And your spirit can go forth and do terrible things while your body's at home. Spectral evidence was frequently not allowed in other places, but we allowed it in Salem, apparently because the girls were so compelling to listen to. So the girls would say, I have scratches all on my chest and all on my throat. They did not want me to speak, but I want to speak. I want the love of God. I want to be helpful. I don't want to serve the devil. The girls were frequently pleading with the judges, who were usually also religious leaders in their town. I want the love of God. I want the love of Jesus. Goody Bishop tried to get me to sign the devil's book. I don't want to sign the devil's book. Signing the devil's book is signing away your soul. Again, Puritans really believe that the devil is a physical being who walks around the earth, converting people to his evil ways, and that witches serve the devil. In general, they were starting off by picking at women, mostly women. There were men accused as well. Mostly the girls were accusing women in their society that the men in power didn't like. So it was easy enough for the men to believe them at first. What happens, and it's important you listen to this prior to listening or watching the scene that I have in the next slide in the PowerPoint, which is George Jacobs' trial. There was a whole bunch of ways the girls convinced the judges that they were really experiencing terrorist acts by witches in the night. The judges believed the girls were too essentially dumb to lie and too obedient to lie. Good women are obedient and they're truthful, and therefore the girls, being small, just lack the capacity to kind of make this up. If anything, children have all sorts of imagination and can make anything up. Especially bored, repressed children who are not given proper outlets, like they start getting real creative. But this is just not something they understand. Among the behaviors that happened in the courtroom, you would pull the accused. You would pull John Proctor. You would pull Goody Proctor. You would pull Giles Corey. Giles Corey a little different, but you would pull these people, and they would be standing in front of the judge, and the judge would look at the girls and say, what did they do to you? And the girls suddenly would start doing these behaviors. Mimicry, though that's of course not what they called it. Fainting. They fainted a lot. You can pretend to faint and swoon. Mimicry would be, say John Proctor starts to talk, and he says, Your Honor. The girls would all uniformly, a group of 12 of them, go, Your Honor. And then he would go, Stop it. And they'd go, Stop it. And he'd go, No, stop it. And they'd go, No, stop it. You guys played this game as children, the mimicry game. When you want to annoy the absolute hell out of somebody, you just repeat everything they say until they lose their mind. Apparently, this is a sign of witchcraft. It was permitted as a form of oppression. The girls would clutch at their throats and look panicked, like they couldn't help but repeat what was being said. And the judge would say, Release them from your spell. Let them speak. The girls would say they had trouble breathing. The girls would occasionally say inappropriate things. Meaning, like I said, Bridget Bishop, the attractive unmarried widow who owns her own house and has her own business and is fairly successful, who's attractive, and that women would have known about her red, like, undergarments, and, word gets out, and then suddenly there's people in town crying witch on Bridget Bishop and her red undergarments. That's a very salacious detail. Like, you would only know what she's wearing if you saw her wearing very limited clothes. Women would have seen each other like this because they're helping each other mend their clothes or whatever, but suddenly the men in the town had an excuse to be like, yeah, you heard Bridget Bishop, her spirit going around in the red undergarments. These are not topics they're ever allowed to talk about in any other way, but suddenly they're allowed. Do you want to talk about that? Of course you do. Sex sells, it always has. So the idea that the girls could suddenly say things like, an attractive, unmarried 16 or 17-year-old girl, which is around their marriageable age. Like 16's a little on the young side, but like that's about where you start looking for a husband. They could suddenly stand in front of their town, which has all of their potential suitors and husbands in it, and they could go, the woman, her spirit flew in through my window at night and laid down on top of me and pressed against me and clawed at my clothes until I was naked and I could not move and I could not breathe. And she lied there on me. Now, those are very sort of interesting details, right? Something that the Puritans would never in a million years have ever been allowed to discuss. But now they can talk about it. So even these judges, these stiff judges who are also reverends, they have the ability now to talk about pretty girls, half-clothed, tearing at each other or sharing bed space at night, and it's like they're kind of going, I mean, we have a witchcraft problem here. Clearly, we have to keep discussing all of these details over and over and over again until we crack the code and find the very last witch in Salem. They kept saying the devil is running loose in Salem. The devil's not running loose in Salem, but you guys have a whole host of issues related to your obsession with perfectionism, the behavioral standard you hold yourselves to, and the fact that you don't accept sort of normal human behaviors from other people. Now, the other thing that would happen is the girls would see invisible things. So spectral evidence wasn't just the ghost or the spirit of other people, but it was also invisible things. So while someone was speaking, and at one point, a very proper woman who said to the courts, these girls are clearly making it up. They're children. Children do this. Children play games. Children invent things. You have to ignore them. The girls start getting annoyed. They don't want that idea planted in the heads of the men that they're appealing to right now. But this woman and another guy get together and they start talking to one of the girls. And she's the weak link in the chain. Mary. She's the weak link in the chain. So they keep looking at her and they're like, listen, we know you guys are making it up. You're making it up, right? And she's like, we wouldn't make things up. But they're like, you totally are making this up. And she eventually confesses to them that, yes, the girls are making it up. So they pull her away from the other girls, bring her to court, which is just in the same room as the other girls in the mean girl clique that she's now tattling on. And they stand her in front of the judge and say, tell the judge how you're making this all up. And she's now staring at the girls, terrified, because she knows how powerful they are. She knows how many people she's put in prison. And some of these people have already been hung. She understands that she's in a really dangerous position. Like, she's always looking to make somebody happy with what she's saying. So she told them that she was making it up because it's what they wanted to hear at the time. Now she's terrified. So she starts saying, like, we made it up. And the judge is like, what do you mean you made it up? And she's like, we just made it up. He's like, how did you make yourself faint? She's like, you just do it. He's like, how did you make yourself sweat and shiver? She's like, you just do it. He's like, how did you make yourself mimic those words? She's like, you just do it. Then, without missing a beat, all the other girls look at her and then stare above her at the ceiling and start absolutely losing their minds in terror, going, why do you send your spirit forth as a little bird, Mary? Mary, stop doing it. Mary, it's a sin. Mary, that's bad. That's what the devil would have you do. And they start pretending to see a magical spectral bird attacking them. And as a group, which is a very compelling way to see it, like with just me kind of acting it out, it's not as fun. But with a group of 12, 13 girls doing it all at once, going, oh, stop it, Mary, stop it, stop having the bird attack us. This is really entertaining at the very least to a society with no television, no plays, no gambling, nothing to entertain them. This is live entertainment. So, of course, the girl who's about to roll over on them is quickly like, no, the devil made me do it, and that other woman is a witch, and effectively pushes it off to the people who tried to get her to confess. And she says, they are clearly working for the devil because they are trying to get me to stop hunting the devil, and I want to hunt the devil. Now, the people in town were not all Puritans. Some were, some weren't. And there's a couple of really sad stories about the social manipulation that goes on in Salem. I'm going to tell you three. I'm going to tell you three. One of them is in the scene in the next slide. I keep going like this because I know it's the slide underneath this one. I'm going to tell you about Rebecca Nurse, Giles Corey, and then George Jacobs. And George Jacobs is the scene that I found for you guys. Crucible, for some reason, is extraordinarily hard to find scenes for online. I'm just hoping that you guys can see the whole thing. So, quickly. I mentioned earlier that there were two women in town, one of which was the mother of a Salem witch crier. She's from the Putnam family, so Goody Putnam. Goody would be Mrs., that's how they say Mrs. Goody Putnam lost 9 of her children. Her only surviving child was Ruth Putnam, and Ruth Putnam is one of the girls that is crying witch on people. Goody Putnam's messed up from losing that many babies. Sometimes they die right at birth. Sometimes they die a little while after. Sometimes she describes them withering. We imagine that might mean a wasting illness, like a cancer or something that killed them as children. But Ruth, at around, I think, 9 or 10, is her oldest and only surviving child. And she is panicked that something is going to happen to Ruth. And on top of it, you're coping with everything. Her husband's one of the most powerful people in town. All of his brothers have like 10, 11, 12 kids, and he only has 1. And they're looking for an explanation. Why? Why is this happening? So the midwife, because you wouldn't have had like OBGYNs, you would have had midwives. The town midwife is Rebecca Nurse, and Rebecca Nurse is one of the most respected women in town. She and her husband are like merchant farmers, hardworking people, regular churchgoers, nice to everyone. As the town midwife, Rebecca Nurse has delivered pretty much more than half the babies in Salem. There's another midwife, so there's 2 of them, and Rebecca Nurse delivers like half the babies. The other woman helps out with the other half. But Rebecca Nurse is one of the most respectable people in Salem. As women go, too. Like, as a woman, she had the respect of the town elders and the preachers and everything. Rebecca Nurse has 15 or 16 children. All of them are married. Everyone, all of her kids survived. All of her kids' kids survived. And Goody Putnam starts getting it in her head that the reason her babies died is that Rebecca Nurse must work for the devil, and when she delivered the babies, she's sacrificing them. Like she's putting spells on them that the Putnam babies die. This is just the sad, sad coping of a very traumatized woman. It's unclear to me, at least from my review of all the materials, how old Goody Putnam was. It's likely, though, that she had 9 children die before her 30th or 35th birthday. That's incredibly traumatizing. Rebecca Nurse is in her late 80s or early 90s during the events of Salem. So she's a mother, a grandmother, and a great-grandmother. And none of those kids died, just their good luck. And what's happening is that Ruth Putnam starts crying witch against Rebecca Nurse. Now, Reverend John Hale, the expert witch finder that came to Salem and originally heard the girls and said, these girls are telling the truth, you guys have witches in Salem. The guy who originally came in and said, no, these girls are 100% being traumatized by witches. The minute Rebecca Nurse is accused, he starts going, this is not right. He had met Rebecca Nurse, and he said there is no sign of the devil on Rebecca Nurse. She is one of the purest people he's ever met. Rebecca Nurse is a woman beyond reproach. When the girls cry witch on Rebecca Nurse, John Hale starts realizing that the girls might actually be making it up. Because Rebecca Nurse said, children do this. She goes, I am 15 times a mother and 39 times a grandma, and kids do this stuff. They make stuff up. You just got to ignore them. If you give them attention, they're going to keep doing it. And John Hale realizes she might be right, because when she starts saying that, the girls start crying witch against her, and she is imprisoned. So is her husband. Another person is Giles Corey. So Giles Corey, I said there are no lawyers, but Giles Corey in the records of Salem had a habit of suing his neighbors. Giles Corey, he knows the law. Your pig is on his property, you are going to pay him for whatever that pig ate. You know why? Because he knows the law, and he's not afraid to bring you before the judge. So Giles Corey was a bit of an annoyance in Salem, like a loving annoyance, like someone's annoying older uncle. But Giles Corey, he heard from one of the girls. They told him directly, we're making it up. And he went to the town judge, and he said, Judge Hathorne. Hathorne, the name Hathorne comes up. Hathorne, I have it from a good witness that the girls are making it up. Somebody told me that the girls are making it up, and that person is a good source, and they are reliable, and they are truthful. And the judge says, well, let them come forth. And he says, they are scared to, sir. And he says, well, what are you doing here? He goes, I'm not scared. I know the law. I know these girls are making it up. Therefore, all these other people need to be let out of prison. And the judge goes, no, you must say who gave you the information. And Giles Corey said, forgive me, sir, but I do not, because Giles Corey knows the law. And the judge is annoyed by this because he's used to being the highest member of society and sort of using that position to get his way. And the fact that Giles Corey pushes back and says, I know the law, you will not tell me that I have to tell you anything. The judge says, press him. Pressing is not like to press somebody, like I could press you for the answer, I could annoy you for the answer. Pressing is an actual sentence. Giles Corey was laid on the ground, and like a wooden plank was put on his stomach and chest, and they put heavy boulders and rocks on him. And they put a rock on one at a time. And every time they put a rock on, they said, will you say who did it? And he said, no. I will not tell you. I don't have to, and I won't. And they kept adding the rocks and adding the rocks and adding the rocks until eventually, instead of saying no, Giles Corey just said more weight. The weight literally crushes your chest. It collapses your rib cage onto your lungs. You suffocate in an incredibly slow, painful, horrible way. And Giles Corey was killed that way at Salem because they were interrogating him for his source, and he wouldn't reveal it. More weight, they say, more weight. Pressing a witch was also a way that you could identify a witch. So obviously the logic here is that if Giles Corey has this information that he won't share, he's likely to be a witch or in collusion with the devil trying to undermine the good works of these girls. So he's one of the many people killed at Salem. Most of the people who died at Salem were hung. A few of them died in prison, just from the conditions in prison, but he was pressed. He's a notable exception to how people died at Salem, one of the more famous cases. Now, the last case is the one that you are going to see, but it bears me explaining the social situations. So I mentioned the Putnam family, the one that had lost all the kids. They are one of the most powerful merchant families in Salem. They own hundreds of acres. Now, the issue that people had with the Putnams that had been brought to court a few times, notably Giles Corey brings them to court. So the Putnams had a habit of like, their property goes here, but they're also going to go on your property and plant too. And then you come over and go, no, you're on my side. And they go, you must be mistaken, that's my side too. So they just kept pushing the boundaries of their property out by just taking what they wanted. And they frequently got in trouble with their neighbors because their neighbors were mad about it, because it's, that's why we have property lines, right? So fences were frequently being built on the wrong sides. Like the Putnam family would build a fence half on someone else's property. One of the people who was their next door neighbors was George Jacobs. George Jacobs had a very notable condition. Both of his legs were not useless, but incredibly weakened. He used 2 canes to walk. So like crutches. He used 2 crutches to walk. So George Jacobs was, first of all, amazing. He had 600 acres to farm, and he managed to do a lot of farm work with 2 crutches. But the man was incredibly physically disabled. So Ruth Putnam, the small daughter of the Putnam family, cries witch against George Jacobs. She says George Jacobs' spirit came to her at night and choked her so she could not breathe. And George Jacobs looks at her and goes like, you're my neighbor. I've known you all your life. And then he looks at the judge and goes, how am I to climb through a window? I can't even walk without crutches. And the judge says, your spirit does not need crutches. And George Jacobs is sentenced as a witch at Salem. Here's the conundrum about witches at Salem. Say I cry witch on you. If you confessed and said, yes, I am a witch, you were put in prison, and all of your property is stripped away from you, and your name is erased from the church logs. This would have been, huge deals, because once your name is erased from the church logs, you cannot be buried in holy ground, which means your spirit's never going to heaven. The Puritans have a complicated relationship with going to hell anyway, but you would definitely not have wanted this, especially because church logs are among the only records that exist from history in this time. Only people who had a job that involved some sort of bookkeeping would have kept written records. Nobody else really did. So if you get erased from the church log and you're a farmer, it's possible that you are just erased from history. But you're alive. So you confess. But your family's honor, your good name, your soul, everything, all of your property, all of it is taken from you. But you live. Most people were not willing to make that trade. So they were accused of being witches, and they said, no, I am not a witch. When you said, no, you were not a witch, you weren't just a witch. You were a witch who didn't care that they were a witch. So you were hung. The conundrum becomes, do you confess to something and lose everything, except your life? Or do you stand for the right answer and die? Most of the people at Salem chose not to confess to being witches. So they sat in prison awaiting their death sentence, and they hung, I think, over 90 people before we were like, okay, we're done here. Eventually, what happens is John Hale, the Reverend expert witch finder who comes to Salem, after Rebecca Nurse is accused, then George Jacobs is accused, Giles Corey is killed, he starts looking around, he's going, yeah, this got out of hand. And John Hale stands up and says, we have made a mistake, which is, frankly, the honorable thing to do, right? I thought I was doing the right thing, but upon reflection, I am wrong. The girls cry witch on his wife. And when the girls come up to Judge Hathorne and say, John Hale's wife is a witch, Judge Hathorne looks at them and goes like, he's a reverend. And they go, yeah, no, his wife's a witch. They want to get him out of town. And the judge realizes if Hale's wife can be cried witch against, so can his. So can any other high-ranking man's wife. Like, if Hathorne's wife isn't safe, then this has all got to get shut down. So Hathorne starts saying, I don't believe that you heard that correctly. I don't think John Hale's wife was the one who did that to you. And sends the girls back on their way. One of the main witch criers, Abigail, the niece of the Salem preacher, she eventually disappears to Boston. We assume she became a prostitute. She runs away. But most of the girls, after being told they're no longer seeing witches, stay in town. Mercy Lewis, Mary Warren, Ruth Putnam, they stay in town, they get married, they have kids, all among the people whose families they helped execute. This is going to create some problems. It's part of the reason Puritanism dies out, because how do you justify this? How do you live with it? And one interesting thing for another PowerPoint lecture is that Judge Hathorne, the hanging judge at Salem, his grandson continued to live locally to Salem decades later and wrote the book, The Scarlet Letter. All right, more on that in another video. You guys are doing great.